Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really intricate subject: how race, socioeconomic status, SES, and intelligence all intersect.
Yeah, it's complex stuff. We've got quite a bit of information to unpack.
And our goal here is really to cut through that complexity, try and get to the core of what we currently understand about these connections.
That's right. We want to look at the current scientific thinking on group differences in intelligence.
Really understand how environment and genetics kind of come into play.
Exactly. And explore the significant influence of socioeconomic factors on how our cognitive abilities actually develop over time.
We might hit on some surprising findings, hopefully paint a clearer picture of what can be a, frankly, confusing landscape.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
So our insights today are drawn from a couple of main places.
Right. First up, we looked at the Race and Intelligence Wikipedia page. It gives a really broad overview, the history, conceptual issues, group differences.
Environmental and genetic factors, ethical considerations, a whole gamut, really.
In second.
Second, we're diving into a study from PMC called Socioeconomic Status and the Growth of Intelligence from Infancy through Adolescence.
Okay, so that one zooms in more on the link between SES and how intelligence changes as kids grow up.
Precisely. It's a longitudinal look. So let's get into it. I think we really have to start by looking back a bit. The history here is pretty important.
Definitely. Okay, so early on, we're talking around World War I, when IQ tests were first being developed and used.
Yeah, the findings were, well, they were pretty quickly grabbed onto to support some really problematic ideas.
You had arguments that certain groups, particularly African Americans, some immigrant groups in the U.S., were just, inherently intellectually inferior compared to white Americans of Anglo-Saxon descent.
And this wasn't just talk. It was presented as sort of a biological fact to justify things like segregation, discriminatory policies.
Yeah, really damaging stuff.
Right. But it's also important to remember, even back then, this idea of inherent inferiority wasn't, universally accepted without question.
No, you had incredible achievements from individuals across different racial backgrounds that just flew in the face of those claims. It highlighted that intelligence isn't really limited by race.
And think about Alfred Binet himself, the guy who developed the first real intelligence test.
Right. His original purpose was quite different, wasn't it?
Completely. He actually warned against thinking his test measured some fixed innate intelligence. He was much more interested in identifying kids who needed extra help in school.
It's quite ironic, then, that his work was later twisted to argue for these inherent limitations.
It really is. But, things did start to shift. Over time, especially by the mid-1930s or so, there was a growing recognition that environment and culture play a really significant role in how people perform on these tests.
So people started realizing it wasn't just about biology.
Yeah, even some of the early researchers who'd initially pushed the idea of innate racial differences later kind of backed away from that, acknowledging the tests weren't measuring something purely fixed at birth.
That shift is important. But the whole debate didn't just vanish, did it?
No, not at all. As society changed, things like desegregation started happening, and the topic sort of resurfaced. You had some researchers continuing to argue for biological reasons behind group differences in test scores.
Which, predictably, often fueled resistance to things like school integration.
Exactly. And then, much more recently, you had books like The Bell Curve, bringing these ideas right back into the public eye, sparking a huge amount of controversy and debate again.
Okay, so that historical context is crucial for understanding where we are now. Let's maybe pivot to some of the fundamental concepts, like what is intelligence?
Right. That's the first hurdle, isn't it? What exactly is it, and can we even measure it properly with, say, a single IQ score? There's still a lot of debate.
Some argue it's much broader than what IQ tests capture, right? Different cultures value different skills.
That's a key criticism. Then you have the concept of G, general intelligence.
The idea that there's some underlying core mental ability.
Sort of, yeah. It affects how we do on all kinds of cognitive tasks. Some researchers find G useful, but others really emphasize how much our test performance is shaped by learning, experience, stuff that varies hugely based on our background.
And maybe the most critical point here, scientifically speaking, what actually is race?
Well, the overwhelming scientific consensus, especially from genetics, is that race, as we commonly use the term black, white, Asian, It's a social and political category. It's not a biological one.
Meaning there aren't distinct genetic markers that neatly divide people into these racial boxes.
Exactly. The genetic variation within the human species is much more continuous and complex than that. Our racial categories don't really map cleanly onto underlying biology.
So when these intelligence studies use race, how are they usually defining it?
Almost always by self-report, how people identify themselves, which is important for understanding social issues, of course, but it doesn't reflect some fundamental biological division.
You might even find different genetic clusters depending on how you sample populations, which kind of underscores that point.
Right. It highlights that our social definitions aren't mirroring neat biological groups.
Okay, so given that race is a social construct, what do the test scores show when we look at these self-identified groups? What are the general trends?
Generally, in the U.S., we do see average differences. People identifying as Asian tend to have the highest average scores, then white, then Hispanic, then African American individuals.
Okay, those are the averages.
But, and this is really critical, the range of scores, the variation within each one of those groups is much, much greater than the average difference between the groups.
So massive overlap in scores between individuals from different groups.
Huge overlap. You absolutely cannot predict an individual's score based on their race. That's a fundamental point.
That point about within group versus between group variation feels like something we have to keep coming back to.
Definitely. One big meta-analysis found an average difference of about 1.1 standard deviations between black and white individuals on IQ tests. Similar gaps show up on other standardized tests too.
But again, averages, not predictive for any single person.
Precisely. And a major APA task force report on intelligence emphasized this too, and also pointed out how problematic the racial categories themselves are, because they aren't really consistent or biologically discrete.
Okay, so we see these average differences. Let's talk about the environmental factors. What could be driving these gaps, if not biology?
There's a ton of evidence pointing towards the environment. I mean, think about basic health and nutrition, especially early in life.
Like lead exposure.
Exactly. We know lead exposure can impact cognitive development, and unfortunately, exposure rates aren't equal across racial groups. Some groups face higher risks.
And things like nutrition, access to health care during pregnancy and early childhood.
Absolutely critical. Iodine deficiency, iron deficiency, these can have lasting impacts. Breastfeeding rates differ too. Access to good prenatal care. All these things, which often correlate with socioeconomic factors and sometimes race, can play a role.
Then there's education. That seems like a huge one.
Oh, absolutely. The quality of schooling, the resources available, teacher expectations. There is a clear link between educational quality and cognitive test scores.
And just being familiar with the types of tasks on these tests can make a difference.
Yeah, studies have shown that even brief exposure to test-like cognitive tasks can improve performance, sometimes significantly reducing group differences on those specific tasks. It suggests familiarity and practice matter.
And literacy skills, obviously tied to education, correlate with IQ too.
Strongly.
Okay, what about the broader socioeconomic environment? Family income, parental education, the neighborhood you grew up in.
That's another major piece of the puzzle. There's a clear correlation between SES and the observed IQ gaps. It doesn't explain the entire gap, but it's a significant factor.
You mentioned adoption studies earlier.
Right. Some adoption studies show that children adopted from lower SES backgrounds into higher SES homes often show IQ gains. That points pretty strongly towards environmental effects.
And when researchers try to pin down specific factors for, say, the black-white gap,
Things like differences in family income, parental education levels, school quality, neighborhood conditions, these consistently emerge as important contributing factors.
we also have to ask about the tests themselves. Could they be biased? Are they culturally fair?
That's a long-standing debate. Some argue that the content of IQ tests might favor certain cultural knowledge or ways of thinking, potentially disadvantaging other groups.
But others argue they predict future success reasonably well across groups.
That's the counter-argument, that despite potential content issues, the tests do have some predictive validity for academic achievement or job performance, even if imperfectly, across different racial groups. So it kind of depends on how you define bias. Is it about the questions themselves or their predictive power?
It's complex. And one more environmental factor. Stereotype threat.
Ah, yes. This is the idea that if you belong to a group that's negatively stereotyped regarding, say, intelligence, just being aware of that stereotype can create anxiety.
And that anxiety can actually make you perform worse on a test.
Exactly. There's quite a bit of research suggesting stereotype threat is a real phenomenon. and can contribute to performance gaps on cognitive tests, especially in high-stakes situations.
Yeah.
The fear of confirming the negative stereotype kind of undermines your performance.
Wow. Okay. So the environmental side seems, well, massive and multifaceted. Now, the really controversial part, genetics.
Right. And here's the absolute crucial distinction we need to make. Intelligence is heritable within groups.
Meaning genes play a role in why some individuals within, say, the white population have higher or lower IQs than other white individuals.
Yes, genetics explains a portion of the individual differences within a population group. But TT, and this is the key point, that does not automatically mean that genetic differences are the reason for average IQ differences between different racial groups.
Okay, say that again. Heritability within a group doesn't explain differences between groups.
Precisely. The current scientific consensus is that genetics does not provide a good explanation for the observed racial group differences in IQ scores. The evidence points much more strongly towards environmental factors.
Why is that the consensus?
Well, partly because, as we said, race isn't a biological category that would support a straightforward group-level genetic explanation. There aren't specific intelligence genes that neatly divide along racial lines.
So no specific genes found that account for these group cognitive differences.
Nope. While researchers look at gene frequency variations across populations with different continental ancestries, they haven't identified specific genes that consistently explain cognitive skill differences between socially defined racial groups.
You mentioned an analogy earlier, the garden.
Yeah, the garden analogy. Imagine two separate garden plots with very different soil quality. Within each plot, the differences in plant height might be mostly due to the different seeds you planted, genetics.
Okay.
But the overall difference in average height between the plants in the poor soil plot and the plants in the rich soil plot is almost certainly due to the soil environment, not the seeds.
That makes sense. High heritability within each garden doesn't mean the difference between the gardens is genetic.
Exactly. It illustrates why within-group heritability doesn't imply a genetic cause for between-group differences.
So what about specific lines of research that have tried to find genetic links? There was Spearman's hypothesis.
Yeah, that was the idea that the black-white IQ gap was largest on tests that were most loaded with general intelligence, and some took this as evidence for a genetic basis.
But that's been challenged.
Heavily criticized, yes. For one thing, we've seen the Flynn effect IQ scores rising over generations. And guess where the biggest gains have been? On those highly gene-loaded tests.
Which suggests they're actually quite sensitive to environmental improvements, not fixed genetically.
Right. And importantly, those Flynn effect gains have actually narrowed the black-white IQ gap over time on those very tests, which contradicts the original interpretation of Spearman's hypothesis.
Okay. And we touched on adoption studies. You said the results were mixed.
Yeah, they're really complex and often inconclusive. The idea is sound to compare kids adopted across racial lines. But controlling for all the environmental factors is incredibly difficult.
Like prenatal environment, selective placement by adoption agencies.
Exactly. Some studies, like the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study, initially found that black children adopted into white middle-class homes had higher IQs than average for black children raised in their birth communities, suggesting strong environmental effects. But follow-up sometimes showed scores regressing somewhat. Other studies found smaller effects or persistent gaps. It's not a clear picture.
So adoption studies haven't really settled the genetics question.
Not definitively, no.
What about looking at ancestry? Like
Right.
comparing African Americans with more European ancestry versus those with less?
The rationale was if there's a genetic component to the group difference, maybe those with more European ancestry would score higher on average.
And did they?
Generally, no. These racial admixture studies haven't found a consistent, significant link between the degree of European ancestry and IQ scores among African Americans. Plus, there are methodological challenges with accurately measuring ancestry and controlling for social factors tied to appearance. Most researchers don't see this as strong evidence for a genetic explanation.
Okay. What about other biological measures? Reaction time, brain size.
Reaction time studies have given inconsistent results when comparing racial groups, and the link between simple reaction time and complex intelligence isn't straightforward anyway.
And brain size.
There's a weak correlation between brain size and IQ within individuals, but it's, well, weak. More importantly, studies show that average brain size at birth is pretty much the same across racial groups.
Oh, interesting. So any differences that emerge later are likely environmental?
That's the implication, yeah. Differences in nutrition, health, stimulation could influence brain development after birth. And looking way back, archaeological data gives no support whatsoever to claims of ancient cognitive inferiority in any group.
It really feels like the bulk of the evidence keeps pointing away from genetics for group differences and back towards the environment.
That's certainly the direction the scientific consensus has moved, yes.
Okay, let's shift focus specifically to that PMC article now, the one looking at socioeconomic status and intelligence growth over time.
Right, this was a longitudinal study using a large UK twin sample, following them from infancy through adolescence. They used latent growth curve models, basically tracking how intelligence changed.
And what was the main finding regarding SES?
A really significant association. They found that children from lower SES backgrounds tended to start out with slightly lower IQ scores at age 2, about 6 points lower on average in their sample.
Okay, a small difference initially, but what happened over time?
That's the striking part. As the children got older, that gap widened. By age 16, the IQ difference between the high and low SES groups had almost tripled compared to what it was at age 2.
Wow, so the gap grew substantially bigger over childhood and adolescence.
Exactly. SES was associated not just with the starting point, the intercept, but also with the rate of change, the slope of intelligence growth.
Meaning kids from higher SES backgrounds didn't just start slightly ahead, but their scores tended to increase more over time.
That's what the data suggested. It points towards a kind of cumulative effect of the socioeconomic environment on cognitive development across childhood and into the teenage years.
It's not just a starting difference, but an ongoing influence on development.
Precisely. The study suggests that the socioeconomic environment keeps shaping cognitive growth throughout these critical years.
Did they speculate on why? What are the mechanisms?
They suggest plausible mechanisms like differential opportunities and support for cognitive engagement. Think access to better schools, more books at home, educational trips, parental support with homework, safer neighborhoods, all the things often associated with higher SES.
So that makes a lot of intuitive sense. More resources, more stimulation.
Right. They did acknowledge that some of this SES influence might be indirectly related to genetics, for example. Parents with genes contributing to higher cognitive ability might also achieve higher SES and pass those genes on.
So they're not ruling out genetics entirely, but the focus is on the environmental pathway linked to SES.
Yes, the direct impact of the SES environment itself seems substantial based on their findings. They also noted some limitations like using different intelligence measures at different ages.
But the overall trend seems pretty clear in their data.
Quite clear. They also look at gender. Girls had slightly higher scores at age 2, but that difference mostly vanished by age 16. Importantly, the widening SES gap was similar for both boys and girls.
Okay, so this finding about the compounding effect of SES on intelligence growth seems really significant.
It really does. It underlines how early disadvantages can snowball over time, affecting long-term cognitive outcomes.
Which brings us to the implications, right? Policy, ethics.
Absolutely. Given the problematic history we discussed, research on race and intelligence always carries ethical weight. But understanding the factors that do influence cognitive development, like SES, is incredibly important if we want to create a more equitable society.
So the evidence suggests that addressing socioeconomic disparities could actually impact cognitive development.
That seems to be a strong implication. If lower SES environments contribute to slower cognitive growth, then interventions aimed at improving those environments, better schools, healthcare, economic support for families, could potentially help close achievement gaps.
It shifts the focus from immutable traits to malleable environmental conditions.
Exactly. Focusing on creating supportive, enriching environments for all children, especially those starting from disadvantaged positions, seems like a key takeaway from this line of research.
Okay, let's try to sum this up then. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
The debate around race and intelligence has this long, often ugly history tied up with scientific racism. But the current scientific consensus is pretty clear. Race is primarily a social construct, not a biological one defining cognitive ability.
Right. And the observed average differences in IQ test scores between self-identified racial groups seem to be driven mainly by environmental factors, not genetics.
And within that environmental picture, socioeconomic status emerges as a really powerful factor, influencing not just where kids start, but how their cognitive abilities develop over time, with gaps often widening throughout childhood.
Precisely. While genetics certainly plays a role in individual differences in intelligence within any group, it doesn't appear to be the explanation for the average differences between socially defined racial groups.
The evidence really underscores the impact of our surroundings, our opportunities, our experiences.
It does. The power of the environment seems quite profound.
So, maybe a final thought to leave our listeners with. If the evidence points so strongly towards environmental factors, particularly things tied to socioeconomic status, shaping cognitive development, what does that mean for us? What are the ethical imperatives, maybe, for creating conditions where everyone genuinely has the opportunity to reach their full intellectual potential?
Yeah, that's a big question. No easy answers, but definitely worth thinking about.
And, if this deep dive has sparked more questions for you, maybe we could explore some areas further in the future.
Yeah, we could certainly dig into specific interventions or the nuances of genetic research on individual intelligence, or perhaps more on the historical impact. Let us know what you'd find interesting.